Good morning. Good morning, Rabotai. Welcome to Breakfast in the Class. Chodesh Tovim Vorach. Breakfast in the Class today is dedicated to loving memory of Miss Lily Safra Leah Shalom Lilu Nishmat Leah Bat Chana. Her philanthropy has reached so many throughout the entire world. As well, Breakfast in the Class is dedicated in honor of Rabbi Friedman and his 6:45 a.m. daily Gemara class, sponsored by Ralph Batesh. That is a wonderful. They used to say there's a shameless plug. This is not a shameless plug. This is a plug filled with pride. This Gemara class has been taking off. So many people join throughout the years here in the Beit Knesset, finishing Masechet, going on to the next. Not easy. The Rabbi prepares a beautiful class. He can be reached on, what's the Rabbi's number? 347-831-0316. If anyone has any questions about joining 6:45 every single day, Hazaku Baruch, we should be zocheh to grow in our Torah learning. The week of Kobru is sponsored by David Yash in honor of you and your substantial capacity to good today and every day. And the month of Kobru is dedicated in honor of Rachel Sayed, donated by her children, Hazaku Baruch. Please do not say amen to this beracha if you're listening to it on the recording. Those of you who are here, feel free to say amen like a chant. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, she'akol nהיה baro. Okay, let's begin. The Gemara tells us that this fella Esav, ki tzayid b'fiv. Why did Yitzchak love Esav? Ki tzayid b'fiv. Tzayid b'fiv literally means he hunts in his mouth. So the literal interpretation is that Yitzchak, he loved the fact that his son, Esav, would hunt for him. And he would put that meat that he hunted, in his mouth. But it's a very strange thing, if you think about that. Ki tzayid b'fiv, that's why Yitzchak loved Esav. Yitzchak was just a carnivore, and he liked the fact that his son brought him meat. I mean, it's hard to imagine that Yitzchak Avinu loved his son because ki tzayid b'fiv. Therefore, the alternative understanding, which although it comes across as drash, may actually be pshat. He says ki tzayid b'fiv, not he put hunting in his mouth, but rather he hunted with his mouth. He used his mouth to hunt. Our Chachamim explain as an example that he used to try and trick people up, convince them to do certain things using his mouth. So as an example, there would be a guy in court. There was no witnesses to the fact the guy lent money. So they would call Esav in. Esav would come into the courthouse and he would trip the guy up on his own words. He would come in there and just let out a roar and tell the guy, "You owe this man $300. You better pay right away." And the guy's like, "$300? It was $100. Busted. He got the guy to admit in court, Odat Baldin Kimya Edim Dami. The fact that someone admitted is as if there's 100 witnesses to the fact. He got him to admit that he owed the money. So tzayid b'fiv, he hunted with his mouth. But not only that, our rabbis explain, not just that he was clever and he was the very first lawyer, but rather, ki tzayid b'fiv, that he hunted Yitzchak himself with his mouth. And how did he do that? The expression that the Chazal say is that he would ask his father, Ech ma'asrin, how do you bring ma'aser? Minateven, minamelach minateven, from straw and from salt. Now, the halacha is you don't have to bring ma'aser from salt or from straw. So his father thought, the simple interpretation of the Gemara is that his father thought, look what a tzaddik this guy is. Hadad's not asking me about bringing maaser from bringing a tenth from the wheat, from the barley, from whatever, from his earnings. He's asking me about bringing his 10% from something that you're not even obligated to bring 10%. How much more so he must be doing all the laws of maaser properly if he's even asking me about something that you're not obligated to bring maaser from. So he hunted Yitzhak with his mouth. I found an interesting sefer called Beurim. It was written something like 400 years ago by a great Talmid Chacham called Rabbi Menachem. And he writes in there something that I found very interesting. He asks, if that's what it means that Esav hunted his father, that he convinced him that he was such a righteous guy, he tricked him, he hunted him. Why? By telling him, how do you bring maaser, right? What should it really have said? What should it really have said, if that's what he was saying? Am I obligated to bring maaser from salt and from straw? He should have said, Ha'im me'asrim min hateven u'min hamelach. Do you bring maaser? What is this question? How do you bring maaser? The question doesn't make sense. How do you bring maaser? You take 10% and you give it to the poor. How do you take maaser from the wheat? You take 10%, you give it to the poor. So what was the question? Ech me'asrim. How does one go about bringing maaser from salt and from straw? You have 10 bushels of straw, you take one and you give it to maaser. You have 10 things of Himalayan salt, right? You take one bottle, you give it to a poor guy. I mean, a weird gift to give a poor guy. You go to the guy, hey dude, here you go, fadal, some salt. Guy has no food, but now he has salt, okay? What's the question of Esav? And I saw the Sefer Be'urim, he writes something beautiful. He said Esav's question was much deeper than that. His question was not, is one obligated? But rather, there's something interesting that happens with straw. Because imagine you gather all the straw that you're going to take for whatever purpose you're going to use it for. Right? I mean, obviously, you might have many different designs for your straw, depending on, if you're a regular guy or Rumpelstiltskin. But the point is, you take all this straw and you cart it away, and now that's easy. But there's a problem, says the Rabbi Menachem. Because while you're gathering all that straw, what happens to some of the straw? It falls on the ground. Straw, I don't know if you know this. I was just in my brother's house yesterday. When they're planting grass, one of the things they do is, after they plant the grass seed, what do they do on top of it? They put straw on the grass. Why? Because the straw is very thin, it decomposes, and eventually becomes like fertilizer for the fields. So if you go to farms, you'll see that they put straw all over the floor, and the straw becomes fertilizer for the earth. And what happens? The result of that is that the earth benefits from the straw. Not only that, there's other reasons as well. It keeps the seed down, it hides the seed from the bird. But the point is, it brings benefit to the owner from the fact that it's on the floor. So asks Esav, Ech me'asrim, how do you bring maaser from straw? Because even if I gave 10% of my bushels, all the straw that fell along the way that got spread out across my field, I'm not taking that into account, which means that my straw for the season has not been properly maasered. How does one bring maaser, therefore, from the straw? Same question he says from the salt. There's two ways of gathering salt. One way is to mine the salt. They would take the large salt rocks, like you have, again, in the Himalayan salt. They bring you the pieces, they smash it up, and then you can grind it in a salt grinder. However, one of the easier ways to bring salt is what they would do is they would take a plow, and they would make a charitz. They would make a furrow leading off from the ocean. The ocean water would come out in these long charitzin. Then the sun would dry the water. What would you be left with after the salt water had the water evaporate from it? You'd be left with salt in these furrows where they would have the salt water gather, and then they could pick up the salt. Asks Esav, Ech me'asrin tamelach. I'm going to go get the salt, whatever I could pull out. But I'm not going to get all of it. There's still going to be some salt that's there in this hole that I dug. And that's going to make it easier next time for the furrow to stay in its proper shape, for me to get more salt in the next iteration of this. So therefore, how do I do the maaser from something that's left in the ground? Now, I read this and I thought to myself, what is the rabbi telling us? How deep are we assuming that Esav's grasp was of maaser? And is he asking such highly specific questions, about maaser, that we have to now, the straw that fell on the ground, the salt that's in the thing? I think what's going on over here, my friends, is something very profound. What Esav was asking Yitzchak is something unbelievable. The Sefarim tell us that you have Yitzchak, you have Rivka, two amazing tzaddikim. You have Avraham, you have Sarah, right? You have all these amazing, forefathers and mothers. And the question is, how could it be that you have someone like Avraham Avinu and he has a son like Ishmael? How could that happen? You have a Yitzchak and you have a Rivka, tzaddikim. How can it be that comes from that Esav? Now, at least Ishmael, we could blame it on his mother. Hagar was, even if she did great things, she wasn't Avraham Avinu. So we can understand maybe where that came from. But to say that the product of Yitzchak and Rivka, of two of the greatest tzaddikim that ever lived, that there should be, that comes out of that Esav, how could such a thing be? Answers the Orah Chaim HaKadosh, something unbelievable. He says that from the beginning of time, we witness this idea. That you could have great tzaddikim, but out of them could come someone that's really not the best. And he explains because the human being has a tremendous capacity for Kedusha, for holiness. But there's also within the person a capacity for physicality. The soul and the body are at war for dominion over the future of that person. And therefore, he says, in the process of birur, of separating the good from the bad, so there are two ways to separate the good from the bad. One way was to have a person separate that himself, but the other way was, he says, the Orach Chaim writes, was to have two children, where you would have one child that would take all of the negative characteristics from the parents, leaving the only thing remaining, so to speak, to pass on to the child was only positivity. Wild. So what was Ishmael, says Orach Chaim? He was the birur, he was the, so to speak, the cleansing process. It was the separating of whatever minimal amounts of physicality were there in Avraham Avinu, so that the child that would be born to Avraham would be born in complete purity. The Sefer Beurim also writes that that's why God waited so long for Avraham to have Yitzchak, because at such an advanced age, there would no longer be any of the passion or desire for sin that you have in a much younger man. So Avraham Avinu, he waits until he's 100 years old to be able to give to Yitzchak. And before he has Yitzchak, he gives him the mitzvah of Brit Milah. So it's only after that point that a Yitzchak could be born in complete purity. And at that stage, wow. So Esav is looking at this, and Esav is looking at himself, and Esav has a question to ask his father. And the question he asks his father, if you really think about it, is heartbreaking. Because what Esav asks his father is, I understand why I am the way I am. I understand that there's the product, there's the teven, right? That was taken and is going to be used for whatever. But then there's other teven. And what happens to the leftover teven? The leftover teven falls to the ground and it becomes fertilizer for the next thing. It disintegrates, it deteriorates, it self-destructs, and it becomes the thing that brings the next crop of teven. I understand that the salt that gets used gets taken away, but there's some salt that remains, and its purpose is only to keep the furrow in its perfect shape so that next time it happens again easier. Esav says to his father, I understand my point in this whole game. I'm the one that allowed for Yaakov Avinu to be Yaakov. I get it. I'm the one that will make sure that the furrow retains its shape so that the product will actually be produced in the best possible way. But he says to his father, Echna Asrin, is it possible? Teach me, he says to his father. How can you make something holy out of the leftovers? How could you make something pure out of something which is only designed, which is only there to support something else? Even in his best iteration, Esav is saying to his father, I'm here to support Yaakov. Maybe I'm the one that goes out and works and he's the one that studies Torah. But you know what? My heart wants more. My soul wants more. Is that all I'm destined to be? Just the teven that becomes the fertilizer for more teven? Is that all I'm ever going to amount to? Now we understand what the pasuk means, that it says, and Yitzchak loved his son. Why? Kitzayid befiv. Because he hunted his father with his mouth. He explained to his father, he said to his dad, Dad, I want you to understand. I get what I am, I'm accepting what I am. But please, there has to be a way for me also to be part of the Kiddusha that you're bringing to the world. And by the way, most of us look at Esav and we assume that Esav was only the cynical liar. Now maybe he was very wicked. And it's very in fashion today to take everything that's impure and everything unholy and everything bad and make it into the holiest thing possible. Every person that ever makes any mistakes, why? Because he wasn't loved as a child. You know why this guy shot everyone in the school? Because they didn't include him in the punch bowl games. Now, that might simultaneously be true, but the person doesn't then need to express themselves in that way, right? Every person still has ownership over their own ma'asim, over their own actions. You still are responsible for your free will choices. But the reason why we point this out is, number one, so that we prevent it from happening in the future. Because this causes people to use their free will in a negative way. We're not explaining it away. We're not justifying it. We're not those people that say that every sinner actually is, he didn't do anything wrong and it's our fault. We're not doing that. That's what the world does. We're in a twilight zone where the only clean people are criminals. And everyone who's actually making an honest day's money, and if you're very wealthy, the more wealthy you are, the more guilty you are. It's a strange time that we're living through, in our society now. But my friends, listen carefully to what I'm saying. Kitzayid befiv. Esav put the meat in his father's mouth. What does that mean? The Gemara tells us a very interesting line. It tells us, Gemara tells us that an Am Haaretz should not really be eating meat. Very strange line. What does it mean that Am Haaretz should not be eating meat? I thought to myself, that's pshat and all the vegans. Either way, the point is, what does it mean that Am Haaretz should not be eating meat? The Sefarim tell us something very deep. What right do you have to snuff the life out of another living being so that you could have a steak? What right do you have? Why could you do that? Why is that okay? And the Sefarim say something unbelievable. Maybe a regular person might not understand this, but we understand the world exists for its connection to the divine, for its spirituality. That's what the world is here for. And therefore, each item in the strata of our creation is there to be able to serve the level above it. Not to serve as a degrading term. But what is domem? What is a rock's purpose on this earth? It's to be able to shore up the earth so that the levels of life that are more complex than it should be able to thrive. So the earth's purpose is to grow fruits, vegetables, trees, whatever. And those things are tzomeach. You have domem, something which is inanimate. Then you have tzomeach, something which grows. So the domem exists to be able to support the tzomeach. The tzomeach, who eats all the plants and vegetables, right? Chai, a living thing. The animals eat plants and vegetables. And the reason why that's okay is because it exists to be able to become part of a higher life form than itself. Each time the earth serves a tzomeach, it becomes a part of the story of the tzomeach. A desert, so to speak, is a sad place because it doesn't have the ability to be able to sustain life in that way. So it stays in its own place. It stays in the most humble of places. The tzomeach, on the other hand, has a chance to be, so to speak, a servant to and thereby a part of a chai, a living being. And therefore, a chai also has a higher life form that it can also sustain and thereby become part of. And what is the upgrade for the chai? To be part of the midaber, of the life of a midaber, of one who speaks, who thinks of a human being. Says the Gemara, if you're Am Haaretz, if you live life as an animal, and you don't live for a higher purpose, you're not someone who studies Torah, the moral guiding point for humanity. You're living life as an animal. By what right do you eat an animal? You're not raising the animal. It went from being an animal, alive, to serving an animal who's dead, and being dead, and it didn't get raised at all. So therefore, the Gemara says, why would an Am Haaretz be able to eat meat? Says the Gemara, says the pasuk here, something so profound. And Yitzchak loved Esav. Why? Ki tzayid befiv. Why? Because he was hunting, he put meat in his mouth. He saw that Esav understood this process of the service of a lower form, so to speak, of a lower element serving something higher than it, serving something above it. And because of that, my friends, what were we witnessing? What were we seeing over here? We're seeing the process unfold of Yitzchak therefore choosing, because of this love, to make Esav the one who received all the physical blessings. Because if Tzayid B'fiv, if Esav gave that to him, to Yitzchak, then surely this would be Ech Ma'asrin. This would be how you raise Teven and Melach. This is how you raise it. By giving it a part to play in something maybe that's above its pay grade. But what Yitzchak did not understand was that was Esav's relationship with him as his father, not with him as a tzaddik. And that would not play into account if Yitzchak was to pass and then Yaakov would become that thing. And the proof is, the second Yaakov takes the beracha, what does Esav say? Yikrevu yemei evel avi. And when my father dies soon, I'll be able to go and kill my brother. All of this in the end didn't actually work the way Yitzchak would have hoped to see in Esav. But I do believe that there's a kernel, an element of truth in this sadness, in the sorrow of Esav, where Esav is basically recognizing that, you know what, there isn't a way for me to express my spirituality, and if that's the case, where will my beracha come from? And when the berachot are taken by Yaakov, that's the tremendous pain that Esav feels, where we see that there's a dividend that gets paid. I'll end with this. The Gemara tells us that when Esav cried out this great and bitter cry, that cry reverberated throughout history. And how did that happen? It happened that later on in history, Haman would cause such a terrible calamity to happen to the Jewish people that Mordechai would go out in the same words as Esav, Vayizak ze'aka gedolah mara. He called out in a great and bitter cry. My friends, it always bothered me this. Yaakov took the berachot that he was supposed to take. They were his. So Esav cries. Why is that Yaakov's problem? To the point that later on, Haman gives a decree to destroy the Jews, and Mordechai has to cry out and say, where's the symmetry here? Listen carefully. It's not that Yaakov was being punished with a great and bitter cry for a great and bitter cry. They're not the same. But what God was doing was something very simple. Esav asks a fundamental question. If I can't pay you to study Torah, if I can't work the earth, I can't bring you, that's not my reason to exist, to support the Jew, to support Am Yisrael, to support God in this world. If I don't have that option, there's only one other way that he could support the mission of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's people on earth. If he can't do it in a positive way, Haman, Esav becomes the tool that God uses throughout history to be able to remind the Jews, to wake them up in a negative sense. So Haman's fulfillment of Vayizak ze'aka gedolah umara comes from the moment where there was nothing left for Esav to do as part of the reka of spirituality in this world. And that's what the Gemara is trying to communicate with this Vayizak to that Vayizak. May Hashem bless us always to be able to see the pain in people, to be able to find a way of including people in some way, shape, or form in our mission, in our community, in our growth. And may Ezat Hashem, may Kadosh Baruch Hu help us to always be able to be parents that can guide our children to the best possible outcomes. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen. Rabbi Chananya ben